Hey everyone, this is for Chapter 9, for Part 2 of Chapter 9 for Project Management. So this is following up on our SDLC, our Software Development Lifecycle that we talked about this week. So why do you want to know this? Again, you're most likely going to be involved in some type of project within your career. Most of the time it's going to be Software Development Lifecycle, but it might be another project. What you're going to want to know is that project management is very important to a project. The primary reasons why projects fail, you're going to learn about those so that you're not making these mistakes, or you're allowing your project team to not make these mistakes. You're also going to learn about primary project planning diagrams that can help you plan for your project success. You're going to want to look at those as a business person to make sure that the project's on track. And then we're going to talk about 3 different types of outsourcing along with benefits and challenges, because you might have to go outside to get resources and help with a project. And then business people, this is probably the biggest one. Business people are asking people, their associates, to do more with less. But all of this will hopefully tell you to not skip on the basics. So just to do a refresher of what we learned in the first part of Chapter 9 was the SDLC phases. So remember, we had planning, analysis, you do the design, and then the development of the system, you test it, you implement it, and then you go into maintenance, and then you might have to plan for other maintenance things that come up or fixes that you want to do to the system. The chapter, I thought, did a really great job of outlining the primary reasons why projects fail. I know this slide's a little cluttered, but we are going to focus on each one of these. So one of the main reasons why they fail is you don't have the solid project management skills that you need to help avoid these primary reasons for project failure. That's probably number one. The second, I would say, the most common is missing or unclear business requirements. We talked a lot about this last week, but these really drive the entire system and how it's developed. This is probably the most common issue. The system will not be successful if you do not have your business requirements written out. The system is developed for the business needs, so the business needs really have to be driven out. I can't say that enough. Also, when timelines start getting tight, people start skipping phases. Maybe we can skip the design phase and go right into development. No. All of the phases in the SDLC are important. If you skip one, you're skipping a major part, and it's really going to be hard for your project to be successful. Also, changing technology. This is something that people need to prepare for. Technology is changing faster sometimes than you can implement the system that you're going on. If you're not really preparing for this as part of your project, you may fail because technology is moving fast. Also, cost of finding errors in the SDLC. This is probably one of my favorite things to talk about, because if you find errors like in your requirements in the beginning phases, so if we go back to that slide about our phases, if we find them during planning and analysis or even design, it's still pretty early in the project. So finding them here isn't going to be as costly as if we find them after we've developed during testing or implementation. Those then become very, very costly. They're going to be more expensive to fix, more resources, and it might cost your project its timeline as well. The other thing from a project management standpoint is this thing called triple constraints. So a project manager is usually managing the project to the timeline, the cost, and the scope. If one of these things get changed, it's going to impact at least one of the others. An example of this is if the timeline changes to be shorter, you may have to hire more resources to get the project done on time, or you may need to cut scope, which means you might not get all of the functionality that you want. So there's lots of impacts to not having a good time, cost, scope measurement to a project. And this is just a picture of usually how the triple constraint is portrayed. So if you think of it as a triangle, there's time, resources, and scope. If time gets shortened, so let's say this gets shortened, that means resources are going to get longer. So you either need more resources or you may need to cut your scope. You need to make sure that your triple constraint looks and is the exact same length on all 3 sides. So that's a big deal for a project manager to make sure that they manage that. As a project manager, again, this slide is very busy, but this is what they have to do during project planning. So as they're going through a project, they're working with all of you, business area, IT, testers, anybody that's involved in this project to develop all of these things. So a communication plan is really defining how, what, when, and who regarding the flow of the project information. So who needs to be informed, who needs to be kept in the loop. This is usually a formal document. An executive sponsor is the person who's going to provide the financial resources for the project. They may also be the person that you go to if you run into a roadblock as well. So if you need more money, you need more resources, or you need to change the scope, the executive sponsor is usually going to be the one who approves that. Project assumptions, they're also capturing those. So these are things that can be considered true, real, or certain without proof or demonstration, meaning that they are truly assumptions that you're making of this project. So it could be, hey, everybody's going to work a 6-hour work week, or this project is being developed based on a 5-hour work week, but everybody's going to work an additional 6 hours of overtime every week. So those are things that haven't been demonstrated yet, but they're assumptions that we're making about the project. Project constraints, these are specific limits. You know, if we only have a certain budget, or we have to meet, which you guys know that the project that I'm working on, I have to meet October. That's not changeable. So we have to maintain, and that's a constraint for us. We have to figure out how we're going to meet that date. And it may mean cutting scope or adding resources. The project deliverables, they're also identifying as a project manager. These are the measurable, tangible, verifiable outcomes or results. So what are your teams going to prepare for this? So examples of project deliveries could be the design documents or the business requirement documents, or testing scripts, or even the development of the system. So they're tracking all of those deliverables. Usually a project manager is part of the project management office, typically called PMO. So it's usually an internal department that's overseeing all projects through the whole organization. They're typically the ones that are formalizing and professionalizing the project management expertise and leadership within the company. They're also the ones who are also supposed to be educating others in the company to make sure that projects are being run very successfully. Project milestones, they're also gathering these. So these are the key dates when a certain group of activities must be performed. So if we need to have the analysis phase wrapped up by March 15th, that would be a milestone. So at March 15th, we should have a deliverable of a requirements document. If a project milestone is missed, chances are the project is experiencing problems, and there's going to have to be some work on the project manager's side with the project or the executive sponsor to figure out, are we changing any of those triple constraints? So is there cost changes, resource changes, or scope changes to get back on track if you really need to meet a date? Project objectives, these are quantifiable criteria that must be met for a project to be considered a success. So objectives, we've talked about writing SMART objectives, so specific, measurable, attainable, reliable, and testable. So when you're coming up with objectives, what does this project need to meet? They should be written as a SMART objective. Project requirements document, we talked about this a little bit, but this is really key for managing the expectations, controlling the scope, and making sure that the system is being developed out in the correct manner. So that would be a deliverable. Project scope statement. So this links the project to organization's overall business goals. So essentially what this does, it describes the problem. What's the problem that the project needs to solve? And then the justifications and requirements to create that scope. So what scope does the team need to stay in? Kind of like defining the boundaries of a house or the infrastructure of a house. For this project, we need to stay within these confines. It also defines the work that must be completed to deliver the product, specific features and functions, and it also would include those constraints, assumptions, and requirements that we talked about above. Those are all components necessary for developing the cost estimate, because the project manager essentially is responsible for creating that cost estimate of this project. Project stakeholders, you will probably be a project stakeholder. So this is individuals and organizations involved in the project. People that might be impacted during the project or even after the project, after project completion. So it encompasses all of those. That's usually part of the communication plan. All of those stakeholders are being communicated to and also pulled into the project as needed. They also create a responsibility matrix. So this is defining all of the project roles. So testers, all the different types of testers that might be needed, the developers, the business area SMEs, so subject matter experts, anybody that's needed in this project, and then it indicates what's their responsibility for the project. This helps them make sure that they have the right people on board to make this project successful. And then they typically create a status report. So these are going to be periodic reviews of actual performance versus the expected performance. So maybe when we hit a milestone, that is when they create a status report. Some people or executive sponsors want to see a status report daily. Some want to see it on a weekly basis. They're typically high level, but call out where there might be roadblocks or risks associated to the project. So if you're thinking about going into project management, this is a lot of work. This is typically done all during planning, but then it's all maintained all the way through implementation, sometimes into maintenance. So they are doing quite a bit for the project. So those are just some of the elements of project planning. So why do we do project planning? Well, project planning helps us answer a lot of these questions, as you saw from the previous slide. They help figure out how our deliverables are going to be produced, what activities or tasks need to be accomplished to even produce those deliverables, who's going to be responsible for performing those tasks to get those deliverables out, what resources are required. Do we need people outside? Do we need additional IT resources? Do we need more business analyst resources? Do we need more business SMEs, subject matter experts? They also track when will a task be performed, how long it will take to perform each task. Are there any tasks that are dependent upon one another? So meaning you can't start one until the other one's finished. How much does each task cost? What skills or expertise are needed to perform each task? How is performance of the task being measured? Because measurement is very critical to a project. How issues are being tracked, how change is being addressed or even tracked, and then how communication is occurring and when, and also what risks are associated with each task. So really during project planning, you are figuring out the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Very, very important to make sure that your project runs successful. So when you do work with a project manager and they do this for you, please say thank you. It's a hard job. So how does a project manager actually track all of this stuff? Well, there are a lot of tools out there that can actually be used. There's Microsoft Project and other types of tools that can be used. Two primary diagrams that the project manager typically uses once they put it into these tools are Gantt charts and PERT charts. So let's start with the PERT chart. So these can be created from a technology if you decide to use a technology. But a PERT chart really, it's called Program Evaluation and Review Technique. So it gives the project manager a way to really look high level at the project, but yet focus on the milestones of the project. So it's a chart, so you can see it's a graphical model that depicts a project's tasks. So the tasks are represented as these boxes, and then the relationships between them. So the arrows actually show where there's dependencies. So if we go up, we cannot design the hardware until we formalize specs in this particular example. It really works well to show those dependencies, and it also shows the critical path. So where you start and where you finish, the critical path is going to be the shortest place you can get there, or the shortest time you can get to the end while still finishing the critical tasks. So formalizing the specs, designing the software, testing the hardware, completing the software, and releasing the software, that is the critical path in this PERT diagram. Designing hardware, breadboard hardware, I'm not really sure what that is, it's just an example. But these are things that are less critical. They may need to be done, but they are less critical in order to get to this spot. So what they're really looking at is what is the shortest time we can get this in by just completing the critical tasks. So a PERT chart is very helpful to a project manager in this aspect. Another chart is the Gantt chart. This is the one I'm most familiar with. This is what I've used as a project manager in my lifetime. So it's a simple, essentially it's a simple bar chart. You enter in a whole bunch of information, dates, times, who's doing it, the dependencies, all of that stuff, and you run a Gantt chart against it, and you can see that all of these things listed out here are going to be the tasks. And then depending upon how long they are, that's the duration. So how long is it going to take me to complete that task? And can I start? So like this one can start before that one finishes. There's a couple up here that can't actually start until it finishes. So it does show your dependencies, but it shows them, and your tasks, it shows them in a almost calendar-like view. So you can actually see the project schedule and everything that needs to be done in order to meet that date. Now if these things move, That's where this Gantt chart gets really important for a project manager, because they can start seeing how far the date is actually slipping out. If we can't start a task before one ends, it's going to push the date out. So that is what they're managing to. And then they'll come back to that triple constraint to say, do we need to change cost, do we need to change resources, or do we need to change scope in order to meet that date? Again, not every project is dependent upon date, but most of the time they're going to try to do everything they can to stick to the date that they originally planned for. Another thing a project manager has to worry about is outsourcing of projects. So an organization really has two choices to develop and maintain their IT systems. One, they can have an in-source or in-house development team, meaning their IT actually resides and they pay them from the company's resources. So that's where they have the professional expertise within the organization. Or there are some companies that can't afford all of that overhead to have those employees as employees, so they outsource it. So this is really an arrangement between one organization and another, where an organization outsourced would provide services to the organization that chooses not to perform them in-house. Most of the companies I've worked for are insourcing, so they actually have the IT staff as part of their employees. But I have worked on projects where we have outsourced and brought in external expertise because they were cheaper. Some other reasons why people outsource are core competencies. A lot of the times when you bring in an external or outsourced resource, they are very well attuned to what the best practices and business processes are of a technology resource, and they come at a lower cost because it kind of ties into financial savings. When you hire all of those people as employees, you're not just paying their salary, you're paying for their benefits, their time off, all of that stuff. With a external or outsourced resource, you don't have to pay that. You enter into a contract with them and you pay them with whatever amount is on the contract. You don't have to worry about paying them benefits and other things. That's for the company that you're outsourcing with to provide to them. So it is cheaper to hire people, especially those that are maybe not within the U.S. So India, China, other places, their salaries are a little bit lower than the ones in the U.S. So companies do save money by hiring outsourced resources. And then rapid growth. Companies need to be able to get their products to market quickly and still be able to react to market changes. So a big advantage of outsourcing, they can acquire the resources required to speed up organization or operations or scale to new demand levels. So they can have their internal resources continue to focus on building their company while the outsourced resources focus on maintaining and upgrading their systems. And then the internet and globalization, it's just made it more comfortable for people with outsourcing abroad. Usually companies would keep it, internally, but the internet has opened up such a wide, vast variety of resources that you can, people do outsource to India and China because you can do around-the-clock development. So you can have some people here in the U.S. doing development, and then when they go to sleep, you have other people around the world doing development. So it speeds up the project, essentially. So there's definitely benefits for why you would outsource. So I've alluded to some of these already, but there are different types of outsourcing. So there's onshore outsourcing, which is engaging another company within the same country for services. So US to US, India to India, etc. Nearshore outsourcing is contracting an outsourcing arrangement with a company in a nearby country. Often the country will share a border with the native country, so maybe US to Mexico. And then offshoring resources is using organizations from developing countries to write code and develop systems. In offshore outsourcing, the country is usually far away geographically from the native country. So there are benefits and challenges to outsourcing. So benefits include increasing quality and efficiency of business processes. So again, we talked about that. You're bringing in expertise from the industry. They are experts in this area. You can also reduce that operating expense for headcount. Again, you're not paying for those employees. You have access to outsourcing service providers' expertise, their economies of scale, best practices, and also advanced technologies. You may have to bring in technologies into your house if you're going to do in-house development, which may be costly. So if you outsource it to group that already has expertise in this area, they may already have access to those tools, so you can get rid of that cost as well. And then it increases that flexibility for faster response, and we already talked about that. You can work around the clock if you do globalized outsourcing, etc. Challenges to this are definitely the length of contract. Definitely can be difficult to break the contract if you need to. There's also the risk that the outsourcing could fail, and then you have to develop all of that expertise internally if you decide to go back to having an in-house. And you also have to forecast the needs for the next several years to make sure that the contract covers all of that. So there's definitely some big challenges to outsourcing. There's also the threat to competitive advantage. So many businesses view MIS as a competitive advantage, and so having that IT in-house, you keep that expertise in-house. Outsourcers could potentially share your company's trade secrets. Usually it's written in the contract that they don't. However, nothing's ever ironclad. And then there's loss of confidentiality. So you have to share a lot of your information with the outsourced partners in order to make sure that your system is being developed and maintained the way you want it to. And that, could place confidential information in the wrong hands. So there's definitely confidentiality clauses that are put in the contracts, and potential risks and costs if a breach happens. But again, nothing is ironclad. So there are things that you have to think about when you're outsourcing. So that really wraps up Chapter 9, Part 2. So it's really about project management, how to make sure that your software development lifecycle, getting your projects in place, are going to happen. So you do have a lot of resources that are helping you to do that, and also to think about if you're going to utilize your internal IT resources or if you're going to outsource the project. So again, I'm sorry I can't be there this week. It was nice to see everybody. I'll be back next week. But this is your lecture for this module. So everybody take care, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.